Hi everybody, David Cross back with you today. And our video today is going to be for our customers and also for our prospects who are looking at IP control for their environments. And we're going to cover specifically the IPControl 11.0 feature set and its enhancements for the product that was just released in March. In this video, I'm going to go over those features, kind of walk through the new web UI and expose where they're at and show you how to navigate to those. And at any time in the future, feel free to reach out to us, your sales, account manager, your engineers, if you need to have a more in-depth review of these. I also plan to cover both the GUI and the API updates and the feature sets there. So kind of to begin with, one of the major improvements we've had is a feature called VLAN management or VLAN realm management. And within the VLAN functionality, we can now start to define various realms. And a realm within IP control allows you to specify within the realm different ranges. And within the ranges, you can define the start and end range, and you can define the description, and also apply a VLAN range to a specific container or to a hierarchy of containers in order to make those available for assignment. So the first part is we've added under the management VLAN realms, and within each realm, again, the ability to set up different ranges and different names that are applied. In my example here, I have applied my realm to my Georgia lab where I'm managing my subnets. And if I go to navigate to the now Georgia lab and start to look at the VLANs themselves, I can then click onto the subnets. And through the properties of the subnet, there is now a new VLAN IDs tab. The VLAN IDs tab should show you effectively the range that's defined, or the realm, and then we'll see the range selection, and then lastly the ability to auto provision the next available VLAN ID based on its known history or whatever else is assigned, or to select from the available VLANs if you were to have one assigned already and you want to keep that information consistent. So this has been a kind of a major increase here. So again, the ability to kind of expand and collapse that information. They've also at this level renamed the VLAN tab for your discovery, which we perform at the layer 2, layer 3 area to discover VLANs so that we could distinguish the difference between the IDs assignments and what was discovered in the system. The admins also now have the ability to set up permissions that are associated to those different container policies within the VLAN management. And to access those features and set up the rules and permissions for the administrator, you can do that either at the administrator or role level. I'll do mine at the role level in policies. And now the new tab for VLAN access, we can either allow full access or we can go out and search and grant only specific access to the VLANs that are applied. And then they can have set up for read, write, delete permissions and the ability to read and view. Okay, so that's our VLAN management. And now through your administrators, you can now manage that functionality and manage the next available VLAN. There's also some import capabilities for those VLANs to import the subnet and or details if they exist. Now our second enhancement on the list is related to what they call response policy zones. And in our specific case, the response policy zone in terms of an RPZ feed, which would be potentially around DNS firewalls. So when we say firewall, it's not necessarily a firewall, but it's a DNS service that has a set of blacklisted zones or IP addresses or records that integrate with your DNS to prevent your clients from querying those known malware sites and so forth. So what we've defined then effectively is the ability to set up a feed, whether you're using the BT Diamond DNS firewall or a third-party provider, to specify the name, its IP address, and for any kind of bind compliant firewall feeds, you would set up a transaction key to allow for the zone transfer, and we handle all of that information with the server and then validate. And then we'll set up a zone transfer configuration for the server to then transfer the zones and at that point start implementing the RPZ. So it does provide now a feed wizard that we would walk through and set up these values. The second part of the RPZ is in terms of the domain. When the domain is created, and I have a few RPZ zones, the RPZ flag will indicate a local RPZ And in so flagging this information, when we then go into the domain, which will actually, we're still here, I can then click Add Resource Record, and I'll see now an option for record type standard, which is your default. This is applying that the checkbox is not enabled. And then if it's enabled, we're going to have the different types of triggers available to the DNS response policies. And effectively what these are names to answer the question name. You have then the IP address or subnet of that answer, the name server that's responding to the server. We can make modifications and triggers, and the name server for the domain name. And lastly, the client IP address, whether you're trying to blacklist an internal IP or a CIDR IP. So if I were to say in an IP address, if I wanted to blacklist a device on my network because it is effectively, say you've got a malware device or some type of compromise, I can go in and set this information up. And what we'll do in terms of the record is we'll format the record for you into its appropriate syntax based on the way that response policy zones format the records. They use CNAMEs only, and in, say, the case of the client IP, it is the mask, so /32, its IP address reverse dotted, and then RPZ client IP is a trigger type, which then gets appended with the zone and will internally trigger the details for that server. So to see that again, just real quick, the RPZ zones, the different types. If you're doing a subnet, the same thing would occur. You would do a subnet type address, and this would give you the ability to blacklist the entire subnet, right, for a period of time, and then we'll make the appropriate changes, which then is appended, prefix 20 to the subnet address. But RPZ-IP is a trigger in this case. So a well-built tool to help you do the function and make sure that the records are formatted properly. Because when you get into RPZ, it does take a different syntax than many are familiar with at that level. Our third major feature release is going to be related to DNS and also Microsoft DNS. So if you're running Microsoft DHCP or DNS in terms of AD and integration with AD, and on 2016 server, there's now a new server option for the 2016 DNS that will allow IPControl to manage the zones within the remote DNS server and to then set up perhaps the DNS listener to capture changes and to be able to push zone and or updates to the server. This then follows a very similar type structure as what the Microsoft server has in terms of things like the pre-configuration PowerShell commands and post, if you have any commands in your Microsoft server, the root hints for building that root hints zone list, the options, which are applicable to the Windows 2016 server only. So as they start to have the method, we can tell it whether it's file, registry, AD, and then manage several of the different options, including forwarders, listening on statements, and other capable things like scavenging in its interval and so forth. And then like we do with bind, anytime we generate configurations, which was a new version in 10.0, we now keep the last known good config stored with the server, and each time it's deployed, we can show you differentials of what was changed in each configuration highlighted through an HTML page. And so then like bind DNS, to begin managing your Microsoft servers, we would effectively define the server, set up the zones and its delegation, master, effectively how those are defined, and then we would have the deployment capability to push the details to the server using an agent from the Microsoft, and then the ability to capture zone changes through what they call the DNS listener. So using our built-in service to capture changes dynamically as they occur in the Microsoft area. So very beneficial and helpful, and does allow us to sync data back and forth between Microsoft and then managing Microsoft DNS in the 11.0 version. We've also added support for the multi-master DNS in IPControl 11 when used with the Sapphire 10 OS, which is expected out at the end of this month. And effectively, we built some back-end services to help synchronize the leases, the journal specifically. So if you're not familiar, bind has a single master. It maintains all of a journal for any dynamic updates. And as you add other masters to it, they do not have any synchronization of the journal. There's no back-end replication or things. So we've introduced that in our services and based on the appliance to ensure that you can have multi-masters with real replication of data in the journal, and that in case one goes down, the other is active. A couple of updates, I guess, to the database where we've added some additional description and a couple of fields for net name and allocation reasons. Now, one of our, so I can't go into much of that in the details in the database, but just to know that they're there. But now in terms of the policies, we've added a kind of a major feature for single sign-on and SAML log-on, in which we support the ADFS 4.0 in Windows 2016 Server. So in the policies, tools, system policies and options, there's now some SAML configuration options to define the various attributes. There is a rather extensive setup, which we need to ensure for the certificate synchronization, and we have a number of procedures and steps to go through that setup. And we should expect in our 12.0 version or around that time also the ability to set up tokens or to set up two-form factor authentication. So the SAML's here, and then what you should see when it's configured is a SAML logon link, and then you can have the ability to log off the app or to log off globally and or log back in. The DNS updates that we provided for dynamic DNS allows us now to schedule or in real time perform dynamic updates to the DNS records as the records are updated. So if I were to go into my subnet and assign a new IP address, I'm going to have the option to deploy the record dynamically and to do that at the time of creation. So let's just go through the example here. And if I create server as an example, there's now a new checkbox that will then tell us to deploy the changes dynamically. So we would want to ensure that our server has its effective ACLs, can do the keys, and has that capability to deploy the change. So this is a good feature here, and also works in the same line of the delete. So if I take one or many IP addresses and select and say I want to delete those, it will then prompt me for an option, and we'll do this just kind of quickly, that I can delete the resource records with the same as well. So let's go ahead and grab this. I had a pause there for a second, my apologies. And when I delete now, you'll see a checkbox that says create dynamic tasks to delete these records when they're removed from the database. So we've added that capability as well. And for those who aren't aware, I know this comes up in a number of conversations. When you're viewing the subnet and viewing some other things like the search or other different column-based views, you might notice that your fields are going to have some type of counters and a scroll. You might be able to overcome this by using the selected columns and changing the fixed header size and effectively deselecting that ability, and that'll allow the column to grow so you won't have to scroll with the fields. So a lot of people don't know that, so a little trick there to go ahead and just deselect the fixed header table as you need to. So in that DNS deployment, just to kind of go back to that, we have the DDNS updates that occur near real time, and they're actually submitted through a task, which you'll then see the status and the updates and its capabilities. Okay. Now, in terms of the task, we do have and have had some updates so that you can see within the task views things that you can filter by the task messages to make it easier to read. And we've also provided more details in each of the tasks so that you can see more descriptive information, perhaps about why something didn't complete or if there were differences and so forth. So a number of updates that have occurred in the different types of tasks and areas. And then as we get into some of the automation, we have a number of APIs that have updated, and I've been kind of keeping track of the different versions. But a number of things we've added within IPControl is the ability now to import block types. So if you're familiar with IPControl and the tools and block types, this allows you to define the name around a subnet that allows you to group it or allow policies around the type to allow permissions to allocate or not allocate and so forth. So the block type imports are new. And with that, we also have the delete block type associated to it and an export block type function as well. We've added the import VLAN ranges. So when I mention the VLAN range within the realm, you can now import those ranges through the CSV import functionality. The same thing with the export of the VLAN range and the import and delete of the range. We've added the ability to go out and export user-defined field tags. So now we can go out and export user-definable information and do some more additional capabilities with that in terms of what fields are associated to a block or to a domain to a container, etc. We've added the ability to interface with the DHCP pools so that previously when you did an import or an export of the pool, especially an export, you had to know the starting IP address, which was somewhat cumbersome if you had perhaps manual DHCP devices scattered throughout your subnet through reservations instead of keeping things contiguous. So if that happens to you, and I know it happens all the time, we now have updated this so we can go out and get a pool by an IP address that's inclusive within the range of IPs. Much, much easier to work with, especially when we're getting into identifying IPs in the range, what server, and site. We've added a couple GET functions also that go with those imports, exports. So the GET address pools, the GET block type, the GET pool by IP address. We now have some domain functions, which we have a GET domain by name. So that's a great feature. The GET VLAN range by name and the GET VLAN range by VLAN ID. The import block type I mentioned, and we now have an import device range, which in the range you can now tell it to go out and import IP addresses both contiguously, telling it to start or end, the size and the start and end address. And you can also tell it to allocate randomly so that it can do this in a kind of non-contiguous fashion if it doesn't have that information. So a number of ways to build in your reservation ranges, especially if you're using the next available IP, and other functionality for building those ranges themselves or range of addresses. And then, of course, the import VLAN range. And so those are effectively the different APIs that we've added to the system and the functionality that you should then be able to see. And a couple of quick things that we've added in terms of the administrator, which I'll go ahead and show the administrator definition, and we'll use my IPAM user. One thing we've added in terms of the administrator, and of which we're capable in IP control, all the way back to I think 9 or 10, is the ability to have administrators who are part of a external domain membership in Active Directory, as the example. Whenever a user authenticates, we can go out and query the domain memberships, and we can map those to an IP control role. So we might have an Active Directory IP control underscore normal users, IP control underscore read only, IP control underscore master, or things like that. Put your users into those different roles, and when they log in, we can tell them that they can import their administrator or update their administrator to reflect their type, normal master read only, to also update their role. So if they're in a super user role, it'll update, or if they're in a read-only role or others. And as you change membership in the external source, it changes their permissions in IP control as they log in and obtain that different credential source. So if I were to log out, I'm super user one moment, and if I take that out of the user updates and I go back and modify them to read-only, I would only have read-only access on the next login. One of the other capabilities we had in the previous version, IPControl 10, is we had what we effectively called catalog zones. But now as we go into the DNS management and we start to manage the domains, we can now flag these as catalogs. So we've updated the domain registry portion of this. And the concept behind catalogs is that you set up a master server with catalog zones that are flagged, and then your secondary servers effectively subscribe to that catalog so that as you're adding, moving, taking things in and out of that catalog, the servers update kind of in a dynamic fashion with the new domain statements, the keys register to them, and then zone transfers. So we've added that ability to kind of reflect that through the tool, and also any kind of reporting that's reflected with it, and other types of reporting which we've added, like address match list, your domain audits and things like that, which kind of carried over from 10.0, but again, we update these as well. All right, so that's the high level feature set for 11.0. There's a number of changes that have happened behind the scenes in terms of the features in Microsoft, I'm sorry, SQL, MySQL specifically. We've updated the version, we updated our various services. We've also made our discovery and the results manager multi-threaded. So the number of performance enhancement things behind the scenes, but from a GUI and a perspective that you can kind of visually see, these are the top level features, and I'm glad that you could spend your time with me. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your sales account manager or to your sales engineers, and we'd be glad to get on a WebEx with you or share some information with you to help you make decisions. So thanks again, take care, and look forward to seeing you soon.